Hi, I'm Dodge Landisman, and I've been following a bunch of the candidates around running for president in New Hampshire. And the other week, I got to cover Marianne Williamson. Now, if you don't know about Marianne, she's an interesting character. You might know of the various senators and governors who have already announced for president, as well as the congresspeople. But Marianne Williamson is actually, oddly enough, a spiritual guru. She has millions of followers. She has a big support group. And I think it's important to take her seriously. She's usually classified as kind of the lowest of the tier of the candidates, alongside Andrew Yang, for example. But Marianne, I think, has a real following and millions of people who actually do listen to what she says and do listen to her agenda. So I think it's important to cover her. It's important to look at all of the candidates so you really do have your options. As I mentioned before, I like to cover these candidates, and instead of having the 2-minute soundbite, you actually get to see the full speech and get to see them up close. And I think when you're making your vote and you have over 20 candidates to choose from, maybe even more, that's important to have. So Marianne had a very interesting event. It was actually So Marianne actually had an unusual event. It was at a yoga studio, which I think is very different than the usual town halls or forums that you might get. Of course, it makes sense because a lot of her supporters also practice yoga and are more kind of holistic in the approach of their life. So it was interesting to see her as a well-attended event. There were probably about 40 to 50 people. Pretty good for a candidate who has really received pretty much a media blackout. She clearly does have her supporters. And she was interesting the way she spoke. She was certainly progressive on issues like education and marijuana legalization, on healthcare. And if you're looking for somebody who really 100% is liberal, 100% is progressive, and doesn't try to pretend anything else, or isn't a moderate and tries to pretend they're progressive like there's so many other candidates that do. But Marianne, I think, in her heart, is one of the most progressive out of the 20 candidates. So that's something important to take into account. She mentioned a whole lot of issues. She mentioned her support for eliminating college debt and free college tuition, and then she also kind of snaked into the conversation about what she thought about college debt, that it isn't just a practical political matter, but it's also this spiritual emotional matter. And she remarked about one of the issues is college debt and getting an education causes a lot of stress in students, and then the lack of employment further causes, I think, that general sense of malaise and that aura of defeat. And she says one way to really examine the success of the people and really try to get to it is, in addition to examining the political issues, you have to examine the emotional issues. And Marianne actually called for something called a spiritual and emotional awakening. This is an awakening where you could connect further with the earth, and she talked about her support for the environment and saving that you can connect further with the outdoors, that you can meditate and kind of view yourself as an individual outside of how you fit in with the rest of society and create satisfaction that way. And I think that's very important that she does mention that. That it's more than just trying to have a successful life, but it's stopping and appreciating the moment. And that if we discover this self-love within, our legislators, our action makers, our policy makers will also kind of address that and create a better nation. So yeah, Marianne Williamson called for something called a spiritual awakening, which was very different, I think, than most of the things that candidates talk about, which is something I applauded, because what she mentioned is that, yes, policy gets in the way of living your best life and advancing the way that you need to, but it's also an emotional state. And it's an emotional state not only of you, but of the legislators, of the policymakers, of the advocates, that people are ingrained to think so selfishly and to think about how they themselves fit in the scenario. They don't legislate, they don't advocate, they don't make policy with a different mindset, being, maybe I'm not that consequential, maybe I'm just this one piece in earth, and I have to step outside myself into the way I legislate, into the way I advocate, into the way I think. So I thought that was very unique, where she really wants to boil down the personality of the American people and assess that they are living in this constant high stress mode. It's one thing to want to eat, it's one thing to want to live a satisfactory life, but what is all this selfishness of being the most successful person that you can be, of being this ultra competitive person? And you could say with a capitalist economy, that's the way things have always been. But if you look at history in the past, people did seem more relaxed, and people did seem to have their values in order. So I thought that was very unique. I think Marianne, she's been a good progressive. She outlined her basic viewpoints on most of the issues. I want to see her getting a little more practical about some of these bigger issues that are being spoken about in the primary. I think that's very, very crucial. But I think there's real potential. I think the reason you don't ignore Marianne is because you have to look at the religious progression of the nation throughout the 20th century and, of course, the 21st. One of the reasons that you really shouldn't ignore Williamson is because she is addressing this so-called religious crisis. A lot of religious leaders know that throughout the late 20th century and, of course, the 21st, there's been a dramatic drop in membership of any religious organization, that there's been essentially an atheistation of the nation. And if you really examine it, it's not necessarily that Christians have forsaken God or Jews or Muslims have forsaken God, but it's that they've joined the spiritual movement. And Marianne is really the leader of that spiritual movement. She's written countless best-selling books. She has millions of followers. And she calls for the spiritual awakening because she sees the trends of our nation. And it's not that people are losing their religion, but they're just making the religion very different, where it's not about them and a singular higher being, but it's about how they fit spiritually in the rest of the earth. And how they need to appreciate what's around them and be in the moment and love the intangible, but not necessarily have all the reflexive answers. To say, yes, I believe in God. Yes, I'm religious. But other than that, I am just one human being. I don't know what's beyond that. And I think that's a growing movement. And I think that's the reason why Marianne might catch on. I don't know if I see her winning a state, but I actually do see her coming in second place in a state like California, in one of a more progressive leading state, because I compare her to other religious leaders who have run for the president in the past, who have also gotten a lot of attention. Of course, this is kind of the opposite in what he believes, but I could think of Pat Robertson, a religious leader, head of the 700 Club, still popular today, who was a hardcore Christian evangelical. And Robertson came in second place in Iowa and did very well. And he had millions of evangelical Christians saying, hey, we're not being advocated for. There are millions of us that exist, at least in the 80s it did. There are millions of us that exist. We need a voice. And for really a primary season, Robertson was the voice of the evangelical Christians. Now, I might personally disagree, you might personally disagree as well as to what the evangelical Christians fight for, but if nothing else, they have a right for their voice to be heard, and for their voice to be heard in the conversation of the presidential sweepstakes. And I see this as kind of a modern day, even though she's the opposite, I see her as a modern day Pat Robertson, where there are these millions of spiritual followers who haven't had a voice previously in the political arena. Maybe it hasn't been as significant as a movement in the past as it even was 10 years ago. But I think if you look at the numbers, it's slowly growing more and more rapid. And this is a segment of the community that we need to pay attention to. I also look at other candidates the same year in '88. Jesse Jackson wasn't a politician, he wasn't an elected official, but he spoke for many people who felt disenfranchised in the black community. He spoke out in support of criminal justice reform. He spoke out in favor of black empowerment. And I wonder if Marianne is that next step. Now, you could say advocating for spiritualism is not as noble as advocating for the black community, and I get that. But again, at the same time, to advocate for millions of human beings who look at every day and the day-to-day in just a very different way, but in a new way where millions of people are awakening to this, well, why not call for a spiritual awakening in a 2020 campaign? Why not call for the whole nation to look at how some of the spiritual people in the community view every day, and perhaps look at humanity and even look at policy and look at legislation with a little more kindness and a little more human dignity and a little more respect? And I was amazed by her speech. She certainly had the energy, and she was a little kooky sometimes, but I think kooky in a very relatable way. So many of these politicians are so polished and so put together and are so careful and are so slick that if you get a human element from them, it seems very forced. But with Marianne, she's all about that human element. She's no BS. She tells you what she believes in. She talks about the high stress that people face in a very animated, consequential, and visceral way, and I think in a way where she could effectively communicate her message. I think it's all important. It's all about getting Marianne in the debates. I think she should. I think she has a role. I'm not supporting her necessarily, but I'm not against it because she's just so different, so interesting and has such unique ideas and presents with such energy, with such passion, but also compassion, which I think is a very good blend. She has that charisma in her heart, but at the same time, she can be very genial and low-key, and she can really listen to you in a really authentic way. So she gets that balance, that people-to-people balance that you need to be a little low-key with, and also that energy and that bombast that you need to challenge Trump with. So oddly enough, I think she'd be an excellent nominee, and I think all of you should check her out, and I hope you enjoyed the speech. Thank you.
The John Roberts-led Supreme Court chipped away the Voting Rights Act, which is why we have all these voter suppression efforts happening all over the country today that are aimed mainly at people of color. It's the same stuff coming back around again. If you're a Jew or a black person, one thing you know about all this stuff is this stuff's not new. These are like viruses in your system that just come back around. It's that same veiled aristocratic mentality. But other generations have pushed back against it. Let's not ours be the first ones to whip out on doing that. So what has happened is that we have still not, and the whole issue of racial reconciliation is multidimensional. No one thing fixes it. It's a lot of internal work and external work. But we have still not taken responsibility for the fact that economic equity and equality has never yet been fully addressed. And because of it, economic statistics are such that that population of people still lags behind. Now, it's true, Oprah Winfrey, Magic Johnson, Tyler Perry, if you're a genius in America, no matter who you are, you can rise. That in itself is not social justice. Because you shouldn't have to be a genius. You should just be a person who's trying to make it in America. And so I believe we should, at last, do what Germany has done with the Jews. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations since the Holocaust to Jewish organizations. Can't make the Holocaust not have happened, but it has gone far toward reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. We need a plan of reparations for slavery. It is time for that next step. You can never quantify the human suffering produced by those kinds of evils, but it's time for us to go beyond incremental approaches in some of these things. Somebody was talking today about incremental approaches with healthcare. Notice they never talk about an incremental approach when they want to invade a country. They never talk about incremental approaches when they want to give a tax bill, a tax cut to the very wealthiest. Enough with the incremental approaches to some of these things. We need huge strategized acts of doing the right thing. And that is why I believe at least $100 billion, which once again is 1/7 of what we spend on military in 1 year, should be handed to over a 10 or 20-year period, probably 10-year period, to a council of African-American leaders to disperse as they see fit to projects of economic and educational renewal. It's time. I think it would be a great gift to our children. All of the things that I'm saying relate to specific policies. And unless we're willing to address these issues on this level of depth and authenticity and fierce truth-telling, then your two choices are going to be continuing as we are or a better version of where we are. And that's really the choices that the political establishment gives us. There's no way any Democrat who thinks it's as simple as beating Donald Trump in 2020. Once again, it appears sophisticated, it's so naive. There are so many people lined up behind him. All you do, if you're a Democrat, all you do is beat Donald Trump in 2020. They'll be so back in 22, they'll so be back in 24. And the political establishment led us here. That's the mindset that led us here. It is not the mindset that will lead us out of the ditch. So somebody's qualification is that they really know how that system works. That's not sure so, because to me that's like saying they're a really good car mechanic. A car mechanic, even the best, does not necessarily know what road we should take to Milwaukee. And I'm telling you, the road we should take is some deep looking and some fierce truth telling. You cannot beat those kinds of the dog whistles at the polls. You have to override them and drown them out with angel voices. And those angel voices are the angels of our better nature, which are not a metaphor. They mean where one person is racist, where one person is bigoted, where one person is dwelling in fear, we must be dwelling in love for each other and for our country and for our unborn grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That is what's going to lead us out. We must harness love and dignity and compassion for political purposes. But that's not superficial. That goes deep. And in order for us to do that, we must recognize that we are the immune cells of our society. Everything that's happening is that we don't like is like an opportunistic infection that wouldn't have happened had the immune cells been awakened and alive. Too often, people in the spiritual and transformational community have justified political disengagement with a kind of ersatz idea of what spirituality is. And that there is no spiritual or no spiritual or religious tradition anywhere in history that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. Those of us who understand spirituality and personal transformation should not be standing on the periphery. We should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. And historically, we have been. Abolition came from early evangelicals and Quakers. Many of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers, and of course the civil rights movement began from a Baptist preacher. The spiritual voices have always been those who, at times when America had totally swerved from our moral center, came in and said, "What the hell are you guys doing?" and put things back on track. Let's do that now. Thank you very much.
To be here today is a very bad cold, so I came in her place, and I'm so glad I did. I may or may not have made my decision today.
Well, you have years to make your decision. You're supposed to just be listening right
But
now.
no matter what I feel or what I do, you are exactly the candidate we need running for president in this country. Please stay in this race
Thank you.
forever, as long as you can, no matter what happens. Stay in this race.
But thank you.
Okay, so my question.
I will if you will.
Okay, so my question for you is, you mentioned you had 3 pieces you were looking at about the world with education, empowering women, those. Would you consider adding a 4th, that as long as we're dependent upon fossil fuels, that is what is causing so much strife and so much war, and that renewable energies would be maybe one of the greatest things we could do to shift to peace?
Absolutely. I did mention about climate change being an existential peril to the survival of the human race. And then, of course, just like everything else, our Environmental Protection Agency is led by a chemical company guy. Before that, it was an oil company guy. Our EPA, which was set up by a Republican president to protect the environment, now does more to advocate for and protect fossil fuel and chemical industry and agribusiness profits. To the point, this is insanity. This is insanity. Given the fact, this is like what an addict does, right? So Gandhi said the problem with the world is that humanity is not in its right mind. The reason I did not make as big a deal about it is because I think as long as you elect a Democrat, we'll be going there. I don't offer, what I offer is that if I were president, a world-class environmentalist would be head of the EPA. The oil company and chemical company guys go somewhere else. With the Environmental Protection Agency would be given all the power of the executive branch to go forth boldly, because we only have about 12 years to get this right. We got to bring the carbon out of the air. We got to sequester it in the earth and other places, deal with the acidification in the oceans, etc. I'm totally into that. The only reason I don't mention it as much is because I think as long as we have a Democrat, we'll be on the way for that. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I've heard you speaking out 3 times, but I no longer need any convincing. I'm going to be out there
Thank you so much.
fighting for you. As someone in the field and of mental health and a husband who is a social worker, what is your take on the drug and mental health situation in our country right now, along with the lack of health care that these people need to get the help they need?
Once again, many different problems. However, the cause of so many of them, most of them, is the same issue, which is short-term profit maximization. So that, in this case, has to do with big pharma and health insurance companies. Now, anytime the government, and that started with Ronald Reagan when so many of the mental health services were cut, too many people in prison when really, what is their crime? They were mentally unstable. Government is a very powerful instrument, and it should be wielded very carefully. I'm concerned sometimes when the government starts talking about mental health services, because what they are talking about too often is Big Pharma. We need to be very, very careful here, because Big Pharma is the biggest drug dealer in America. That three-quarters, the gateway drug to opioid addiction is 3/4 of the time a legal pharmaceutical, right? And that's why finally some attorneys general are starting to talk about bringing some cases against people such as the Slacker family, what we know happened there with OxyContin, et cetera. So we need to, this is, everybody talks these days about intersectionality, and it's because everything is related to everything else. A lot of the mental health problems actually come from the tension and the anxiety that everybody's living in. I mean, millions of Americans, what am I going to do if I get sick? What am I going to do when my kids get sick? I'm staying in this job, even though I hate this job, I got to do it for the benefit. And I'm going to pay for my kids to go to college. I can give her ballet classes, but if you give her ballet classes, but she can't have ballet classes, how am I going to pay these college loans? All these young people, $1.5 trillion of college loan debt. I can't even imagine what it would feel like to be 22 years old and have $30,000 of debt. But I had to take on the debt because I need an education, because I don't get an education, I can't do what I want to do. So then Big Pharma comes and says, darling, you really should take something for all this anxiety. This is so sick and so corrupt. So billions of dollars being spent using human suffering as a profit center. So first, I'll take all this money away from you, almost ensuring that you're going to be living a life of greater anxiety, and then I'll make more money treating your anxiety. Sure. That's basically what is happening here. So many of these things, it's got to be an integrative approach to the healing of this country. Some issues are internal, some issues are external. Some issues have to do with policy and material changes. Some things have to do with intellectual and psychological and emotional and spiritual changes, including the American people waking up to this. There are no silver bullets. This is a healing process. I think we need, and no politician is going to tell you this, because the game is to make you think, if you just send me to Washington, I can fix it. I think we need, to be honest, I think it's going to take 20 years to really heal this country. But we should be the generation that begins. And it's going to take more than external changes, it's going to be internal changes as well. The FDA has issued a black box warning that for people 25 years old and younger who take antidepressants, the risk of suicidal ideation is actually increased rather than decreased. Psychic pain is like physical pain. It's there for a reason. It's the way the brain tells you something's wrong. So if you have physical pain, millions of years of evolution went into the brain letting you know you have to address that leg. But you can't just take a painkiller, you have to reset the bone. Psychic pain is often the same. The fact that you're upset about something doesn't necessarily mean that you have a mental health problem. It means that something's wrong. And that's why so many American women are depressed. We're not depressed because something's wrong with us mentally. We're depressed because we know something's really wrong here. And until we address it, it's like an alcoholic family where the kids know something's wrong, but nobody's naming it. And so, today, given everything I've talked to you about, if you're not depressed, what's wrong with you? It's not like mental health that we're not looking. There's nothing mentally healthy about the fact we're not discussing these things. And there's nothing mentally healthy about just desensitizing ourselves pharmaceutically. So we have serious problems, but I do not agree with the psychotherapeutic, psychopharmacological industrial complex making, medicalizing human despair. Because there's a spectrum of human despair. You had a divorce, you lost a loved one, you lost your job, these are painful things, or you're in your 20s, these are difficult. These are painful and difficult things sometimes, but they're not a mental illness. And so I believe we need to look at the deeper sources of our despair, rather than just saying to Big Pharma, oh, you can use that to make more billions of dollars, especially when the government's playing along.
I agree with everything you're saying. I appreciate I wanted to just make a clarification. The population that I work with is schizophrenic.
That's different.
Yes,
More sensitive.
and so I just wanted to put that in.
Yes, and I agree with you.
Bipolar disorder, I was came back from veterans.
Yes, but veterans coming back, we need to, it's different. When you say schizophrenic and bipolar, I
Yep.
totally agree with you, and I'm
Yep.
not weighing in on that. That's not my lane. Normal human despair is, however, and when you're talking about these guys coming back, and men and women coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, let's be very, very careful in our conversation. We have 23 suicides a day, but the go-to, and there's some really fine people working in the veteran, there are really fine people working in that system. I'm not saying there aren't. And there are, because it's not about demonizing individuals, it's about talking about systems. But the go-to treatment is pharmaceuticals for these guys. So ladies and gentlemen, we need, once again, this is like America's dirty little secrets. There are as many questions about antidepressants having led to suicidal and homicidal behavior as there are certitudes about those pills having stopped suicidal behavior. And that includes in our returning veterans. When there are programs having to do with meditation, there are programs having to do with urban gardening, there are so many programs in that area as in everything else. We have people already demonstrating, and this is not only true domestically, it is true internationally. There are people who have already designed the systems, who are already practicing. This is true about the environment, it's true about Israel and Palestine, it's true about mental health. So many people who are actually doing the 21st century work, doing the work that will actually lead to healing in these areas. But they're not getting the geopolitical or financial support because the geopolitical and financial system is still based on short-term profit maximization for corporate entities. We will, in the 21st century, we're at a fork in the road. We're at a fork in the road. We're either going to build more bombs or build more brains. We're going to either unleash the spirit or continue the path we're on, which is, why should we be surprised that there are so many mental health issues on the part of individuals when the entire system of how we're running things is basically insane?
So what is this new economic paradigm you mentioned?
The new economic paradigm would mean a massive realignment of investment in the direction of children 10 years old and younger. But that's a more long term. So short term, what you want to do is that immediately to universal health care, immediately into that 15 minimum wage, although I do understand that for some communities that's too big a leap, and I think it's fine for there to be some governmental compensatory help it transitionally. It means canceling the majority of those college loans, with some of them just extending the payment time and lessening the interest rate. It means you do a massive infusion. It's just like the difference between Ayurvedic healing and the Western hospital emergency room. If you want long term, you go Ayurveda. And so that would be something like the much higher level, not just incremental, massively, fundamentally different level of approach to America's children. That every school is a palace of learning. Every school is a palace of the arts. They've not only leached, we're the richest country in the world, and we're leaching, we're not teaching, we've taken arts out of the schools, even though the arts in those schools we know improves cognitive function. And I want to point out the obvious. The people who are economists, who are on these councils, who are leeching all this money, their kids go to private schools. They wouldn't think of their child not having arts education, right? So some of these are like nice people. They'll have dinner, and I'll be glad to have them at the White House, but there's no way they're getting away with this shit. Excuse me, I was told definitely not in New Hampshire let that happen. Sorry. But let's if I may. So you do that, but you need this massive infusion. It's like right now, it's like we've been in a car accident. So you need some massive relief for people. Because when you don't have massive relief for people, ladies and gentlemen, this is where the Donald Trump phenomenon came from. Desperate people should be seen as a national security risk. That's why after World War II, we were very different. That's why after World War II, we had the Marshall Plan, and we did everything to build up the economies of Germany and Japan, because we knew it was dangerous Large groups of desperate people is dangerous. And our political system being gobsmacked by Donald Trump is ridiculous, because if they had been looking at what was happening, but nobody was looking under the surface. You know, for myself, the election of Donald Trump was shocking but not surprising. Does that make sense? So I don't remember where we were that we talked about. Oh, what you have to do. So you have to address people on the level of the despair. Give some people relief. When people are living with that kind of, what am I going to do, what am I going to do? And none of this like incremental approach. I mean, this is how this is incremental approach to universal health care. They don't say an incremental approach to invading Iraq, do they? And that's what it's going to cost $2 trillion. They didn't say an incremental approach to giving that huge tax cut, did they? That was $2 trillion. The American people just need to learn to guffaw. The American people need to reclaim the audacity of the American spirit. We were born of audacity. We were born of saying to aristocracy, no, we will not be doing that. No, that's not what we will be doing. That's what is this at a boundary. We've been trained to expect too little and ask for too little. And you know, this is New Hampshire, live free or die. This is economic tyranny we're talking about here. Okay, we'll give you a little bit. We'll give you a little bit. We'll give you a little bit. Where has that gotten us? When they're not, most guys aren't asking for a little, they're asking for everything, we're giving it to them. And that's not personally negative. You know, there's nothing negative about yelling fire if the house is burning down. And by the way, there's some very, very, very wealthy people in America who know this is true. And are just as concerned about this as we are, because it's unsustainable. You know, and there are people working on more conscious capitalism. People like John Mackey, people like Eileen Fisher, the B Corp movement. I mean, it is happening, but it's happening too slow. And you need a political, you need a Democratic Party who's fully on board. And that's the problem with the Democratic Party. It's like, you know, it's kind of like if you were being, if a child is being beaten by the parent. So one, you know, but then you have the father beating the child, but then you have the mother standing out in the hall, very upset. This is really terrible. And when the child comes out after being beaten, she's going to give them tea. No, we need the mother in the hall to be the one calling the police. And what will happen as the child grows up is they'll be more upset at first at the mother than at the father. We need a political system that says no more. No more, not incrementally, no more, no more. It is the moral equivocation of our government that is the deepest problem. Yes, ma'am.
I had spoken to you earlier about, for the past 8 years, I've been actively involved in the Rye town politics, and the horrible things that have been happening here with a cancer cluster caused, pediatric cancer cluster caused by a Superfund site that has been going on for like 50 years. And without going into all the specifics or details, but in that process, I can't compare myself to you, that would be an injustice to you, but I see that what you represent and who you are and your beliefs is, I was doing this alone. I was trying to save Rye from itself. I was trying to be the advocate. And all that. So what I realized was that, you know, and this, what I saw was that people get, you know, like, okay, the government gets involved and they got a task force going, we got all this. At the end of the day, nothing got done. We got another study. We've got this going on. So they gave you the impression that they cared, but there was no solution coming. So what I discovered is that I think that there is a huge victim consciousness in this country. And I believe, like you, let's treat the cause and not the symptoms. And I think a lot, whether it's the addiction field or whatever it is, there is such dissension, not dissension, but unrest inside all of us. I'm 71 years old, and all I can do is complain about everything in this world. I said, how did we get here? How did we get to this thing? So what I'm asking of you is that those of us who care, how can you come together and say, like, be a voice, stop being a victim, stand up, and
that's what we're doing here today.
Yeah.
And as far as comparing yourself to anyone, myself or anyone else, democracy is about radical equality. Each of us, there's nobody more important than anyone else. In fact, your voters in New Hampshire, I'm not. You have a lot more power at this moment in this political situation than I do. So None of us are more important than anyone else. None of us are indispensable. This isn't about any one person who's going to Washington and fix it. That's magical thinking. This is about an uprising of consciousness in the American people. And you're not alone. As I said to you earlier, millions of us feel this way. And that was true even in this last presidential election. 3 million more people voted for the other person. So we all know we had the policies that are emanating from Washington today do not represent the consciousness of the majority of Americans. This is a minority that has gained political power. However, it's also, we have to take responsibility for that. Because even though there are far more people who love, who have conscience, who would wish to see the water not polluted, who would wish to see the cancer cluster not have happened, we have to take responsibility, I believe, for the fact that those who represent the more nefarious economic worldview that leads to such tragic consequences have been more convicted, have been more active. And, you know, it's not that more people hate than love, it's that those who hate have hated with conviction and have been willing to turn their views into political force. Now we have to do the same. And no, you're not alone. There are people all over this country doing it. You can see it from the blue wave that just happened. So I believe, you know, when I talked about these things 20 years ago, because anybody knows my career, this is not new for me. I didn't just wake up one day and go, oh, look, I mean, I was writing in the late 90s about wealth inequality, corporatocracy, mass incarceration, etc. But 20 years ago, it was a heavy lift. And I even got pushback from the transformational community. Today, that's not what's happening. The last 2 years, I think a lot started changing with the Obama election. And then now with the Trump presidency, I think there's a real awakening, left and right, by the way. And I don't think the way you're going to defeat Trump is just by talking about how bad Trump is, because that's shaming people who voted for him. Hello? And that's an act of violence. That's not gonna, it's to create a more compelling truth where we need to go. So we have to have faith in each other. I'm not saying what I'm saying today thinking anybody in this room didn't already know this, or at least, you know, we're all boasting it. The issue is now knowing there are enough of us who really want to see conscience and ethics put into our government and function. The issue now is let's harness this for political purposes. Okay, I'll take one more. Yes.
Excuse me. I listened very carefully to what you said, and I also read a lot of history. I read a lot of military history, a lot of American history, biography, and whatnot. And one thing you just said sparked an idea. It just sparked something in my head. You said something about the problem with the Democratic Party. And I said to myself, the problem with the Democratic Party is that it's a party. Whatever that means, I'm not sure where it goes, but it says something. However, what you're talking about, what we're looking at here, is actually history repeating itself over and over and over again. I mean, the same thing that's happening in the greater political scheme right now was happening during the Grant administration, was happening during and the fights that happened between the founding fathers aren't talked about very much.
Absolutely.
And it's the same stuff.
Ambulance slaves. Yeah, absolutely.
The Treaty of Versailles created World War II.
Absolutely.
And every single war that has ever happened, the only successful thing that ever came out of it is that it sowed the seeds for the next one. So I get what you're saying, and I understand that. I really don't think there's an answer, an answer. I don't think that there is but I do know that what happens on the outside, I mean, you're talking about a disease where we are the cells that can help, that can fix
Through
it.
the immune system.
Exactly. And we'll take that immune system to come together.
That's right.
And do something about it. Now, but do something that lasts, and do something that has something that can sow roots. And where you're going with the children thing, I think is a beginning. Because I really don't think, and I thought about this a lot, I'm not sure we can change the thought process of the people that are involved in this talk right now. That's not gonna happen.
No, just, if they would just leave, please, and go. And
Exactly.
I see you, David, you're lovely people. I
Yeah.
know you have the means for your lovely homes. Have a good time. You're interesting
Well,
people,
question.
and you should not be running the country anymore.
Right, and changing their thought process is not gonna
No,
happen.
no time for that. No time for that.
No,
We don't want to just advise and elevate the children were considered just women's work. Women had no place. So now when I talk about things like, no, it has to do with how we treat the children, which is what every species does that survives and thrives, is the fierce behavior of the mother when there's a threat to the cubs. So that's number one. Number two, it is going to take an integrative approach. We need to apply to politics what we already recognize about medicine. That you have to deal with nutrition, you have to deal with taking care of your body, with exercise, you have to cultivate health as well as treat disease. There are external measures we have to take politically, and there are the ways we're all different as friends. All of the work we're doing, whether it has to do with yoga, whether it has to do with therapy, whether it has to do with recovery, whether it has to do with spirituality or religion. This is not either or, it's both and. In order to become whole people, we address all aspects of our being. In order to have a whole politics, we're going to have to address all aspects. We're going to have to rise. We have to rise as the immune cells. We have to do exactly what I've been talking about for many years. We have to love very deeply. We have to pray really hard and kick ass. Thank you.